As always, we go around the table and have the members identify themselves. And our new members, welcome.
Hi, Karen Darch, Barrington, Northern Cook County.
Jim Healy, DuPage County Board, DuPage County. There we go.
Diane Williams, trustee in Flossmoor, South Suburban Cook.
Ann Sheehan, City of Chicago.
Rita Athens, City of Chicago.
Jerry Bennett, representing Southwest Cook.
Aaron Alaman, CMAP.
Mayor Rick Reinbold, representing South Suburban Court.
Matt Brawley, the mayor of Montgomery and representing Kane and Kendall.
Mike Montgomery, City of Chicago.
Again, good morning and welcome all. I know we're going to have a couple of members that are drifting in here a little bit late because of traffic and of the possible confusion downstairs. Again, I'd like to welcome our new members to the board. I think you'll enjoy the camaraderie of this board of directors and the work that we're going to begin again as we start technically our new year. So again, welcome everybody. First item on the agenda is to well, Nancy's not here. We also have another new member, Highland Park Mayor Nancy Roderick, representing Lake. She's not here. So anyway, I'll entertain a motion to accept the minutes of our last meeting. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and second. Any questions? If not, all in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote of no. The motion carries. First item, our new executive director, your first meeting, Erin.
Yeah.
It's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be back at CMAP. For those of you who don't know, I started my planning career here at CMAP. I have a master's in urban planning from Cleveland State University. I grew up in Southwest Michigan, went to University of Michigan undergrad, so go blue, it's football season here. But, you know, after working at CMAP for about 8 years, learning about how important this region is to the state's economy, you know, when the opportunity arose to go to the Illinois Department of Transportation, I really thought it was a great way for me to learn what it takes to implement some of the policies that CMAP had been talking about for quite some time and that we've been working on in our long-range regional plan. And so when I was at IDOT, I served as the director of the Office of Planning and Programming, working on statewide multimodal plans, delving into the state's P3 initiatives, and also allocating the federal and the state funds across to the district offices across the state, and really understanding sort of how performance measures plays into that. And I think, you know, while I was there during a difficult time, I learned a lot, spent a little bit of time in the private sector, and came back here. So this is my second month, my first board meeting. Just real happy to be here. I also want to welcome Amy McEwen, who is my new chief of staff, CMAP's new chief of staff. She comes to us from Lake County. She was the deputy county administrator, and I think brings a wealth of experience and understanding of the region, and will bring a huge value here to CMAP. So with that, I will remind you that your LTA updates in your packets. We're excited to be working with the RTA again this year on this next call for projects for the local technical assistance program. The call is going to open next week on September 17th with a new user-friendly website and application form, and applications will be online and available to submit until October 17th. So if you have projects or ideas, I'm sure our staff would be willing to help you get to that website. It's a great opportunity for communities to get some planning resources and transportation plans and all of the good stuff that we've been doing through that program. At your place here also, there's a reminder of our fall forum series that we're having, Small Plans, Big Ideas. There will be a series of small events happening across the region, and I know we have a number of board members participating and some welcomes there, but really engaging panels on how some of these big ideas can come through in small initiatives and have some big successes. And so there's a forum on safety and technology, on focusing your plan, making it happen from plan to project, really about implementation of a plan, planning for an equitable water future, benefiting from a changing economy. And then this will conclude on October 10th. So after our board and joint policy committee meeting, we'll have an event downtown here, which will be our large symposium, I think, which will close out sort of our application process here. So if you have time, please attend, and please encourage your community staff to attend, and other planners that are working in and across the region. We hope that they'll be inspired by some of the things that we hear. So, with that, I just wanted to make one quick acknowledgement. I know the region lost a friend this week, of Marka Bristow, the founder of Access Living. She was really a huge advocate for individuals living with disabilities and a co-author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I just wanted to just acknowledge that her legacy across this region and across the country has been so impactful. And I think of, just continuing to think about the importance of the work of inclusiveness and equity related to transportation and planning across the region is something that we as an agency can commit to continuing on her behalf. So a brief update on the old post office move. We're still scheduled to relocate to the old post office by August 31st of next year, with construction and the space scheduled to commence in March. Last month we issued an RFP to get a general contractor under contract to complete the construction. Really, it's a vacant, sort of empty shell, and we need to bring it to life here. Through that RFP process, we received 7 proposals, so staff will be recommending a selected consultant to the board at our next meeting. And then our next major milestone will be November 1st, which will be the submission of our final design plans to the old post office team so that we can get that approved and then get the work underway. I'll also note, too, that last week the STP Project Selection Committee approved the Surface Transportation Program Shared Fund of 17 projects for nearly $200 million of federal funding over the next 5 years. The process began in 2017. I know many stakeholders from across the region have participated in this. It was really realigning how we distributed funds and collaborating those principles onto 2050 and really figuring out how we can continuously improve our performance-based programming across the region. So I would just like to thank everybody, City of Chicago, councils of mayors, everyone for participating in that process. It really is a 2-year process that we're seeing come to close here. The program will be considered by Transportation Committee on Friday, and then we'll come to the joint MPO and board meeting next month. So we look forward to continuing the conversation on how do we improve the process too. We know it wasn't perfect. So that's one thing that I know that we are committed to at CMAP here is just reflecting on the process and making sure that we're continuously improving the way that we focus our work here. So with that, turn it back over.
Thanks, Erin. Just a couple of comments. One, if you've been following the news, the incredible amount of new tenants going into the old post office. So we are not going to be sitting there alone in a vacant building. In fact, Uber just announced too a huge transfer of their facilities over there, along with 2,000 employees. The question is whether we possibly gain new employees in the future, or then whether they steal some of ours. We'll see. Now that you're all in the same building, because those are all pretty high-tech, some of those high-tech companies coming in there. So we're pretty excited to be part of a rebirth of the Chicago Post Office. And hopefully convenience of it should be a little bit more convenient, and look forward to eventually that move. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize Andrew Madigan, who has stepped down from the City of Chicago as one of our board members. Andrew's been a longtime member of CMAP. Would like to recognize him, but I know he's part of the reason why he has stepped down. He's so busy. And also Mayor Colapidiatra, who also is no longer with us on the board. We want to thank him for his service to CMAP. And again, we welcome from Northwest, Karen Darch, from Will, Jim Healy, and we still have a member, and also, as I mentioned, Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering will be joining us from Northwest. No,
Lake County.
Lake County, I'm sorry, right.
Jim Healy's from
And Jim's from DePage, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
And we're also still waiting for a vacancy to be filled by the City of Chicago to complete their 5 members, so I'm sure you're aware.
Yes.
I'm hearing rumors who it may be, and that's good.
Yeah.
We can always use some expertise on the board, so.
Great.
Welcome everybody. Next month is our joint meeting of the CMAP and the Policy Board. That's a very big event and meeting, and hopefully all of our members will attend that. It will involve some votes that we need to have a majority here to complete our task on the purpose of that meeting to get us going for the upcoming year. So with that in mind, we'll move on with the agenda under committee reports. Diane, you have...
Coordinating committee.
Yes.
I'll sort of start this, and it'll be brief, but.
Do we have anybody on the phone, by the way? Carolyn? Hello?
Yes, I'm on the phone. Carolyn Schofield, representing McHenry County.
I'm sorry,
Yep.
I missed you earlier, Carolyn. Thank you. Okay, I'm
just-
sorry, go ahead.
That's okay, just start my comments with the way I ended the meeting's comments, and that is the format that we host that coordinating committee meeting in is really a great format. It is an opportunity for staff to share with us in advance of completion of a project what the thinking is, what kind of questions or concerns they have, and to receive feedback from the people that are a part of that coordinating committee. And nobody shies, not staff, nor the coordinating committee members. And so there's a real exchange that takes place. And I believe, based on the feedback, that the comments that are offered are really well received and become integrated into the thinking going forward. So I think it's important. So we had 2 topics this morning. One was looking at the potential impacts of a road usage charge. There's lots of discussion about that. As an aside, I understand that some insurance companies are actually doing some of the same kinds of things that we would do if we had a road usage charge today. So that in some cases, they're actually gauging insurance premiums based on the information that they get from devices that they insert in a car. So they're looking at mileage, they're looking at, sort of how you stop when you stop the car, all kinds of information about how you're driving to make some of those determinations. So it's just sort of an interesting parallel. But at any rate, staff analysis showed that implementing a road usage charge is not likely to have a significant or disproportionate impact on typical households within our communities. And it was interesting to note that I guess you might think that you would expect prices or people to pay more if they were, quite frankly, in lower income communities than they might pay today, but that won't be the case. As the data shows today, they drive less, and therefore they would be paying less than others. And so what staff wants to do is to actually implement a pilot program that would give them a good chance to sort of test things, evaluate, and then adjust accordingly. The pilot program would probably take a long time in the sense that it would probably be 4 years from beginning to some sort of an implementation. And so that kind of encourages everybody to say, let's start now, as opposed to delaying our start. And so that was our first topic. Our second topic was on assessing the equity impacts of existing and proposed transportation fines, fares, and fees. Sort of looking at the distinction between equal and equity, if you will. So if it's equal, everybody pays the same for the same service. If there's equity, there's a recognition of ability to pay to access those kinds of services. But really looking at it at a much broader perspective in that. And so it's just starting, but staff discussed the project scope, looked at the different kinds of fines, fares, and fees that they would be evaluating, got some input from the members as to things to be careful about to make sure you're looking at sort of license suspensions and all kinds of other impacts in those areas. And the first one, a lot of input too, just to make sure that we don't, if you will, disincentivize the use of electric cars or hybrids and that kind of stuff. So just a lot of conversation, a lot of good discussion, and I look forward to our next feedback on how those projects are going.
Any questions of Dan? Thank you for that report. Move on to item 6 under procurements and contracts. Angela?
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, Board.
Morning.
Welcome back. Seeking approval today for 2 procurements. The first one, seeking approval to renew our subscription with Dun & Bradstreet in the amount of $228,000. Staff uses the Dun & Bradstreet subscription for its employment data information and its use for our land use model, the evaluation of regionally significant projects, and travel and emission modeling for conformity. I'm also seeking a cost increase for 2 of our vendors, Thirst, which is our design service vendor, in the amount of $1.4 million, which is the total sum of the contract over 5 years. And I'm seeking approval for a vendor increase for Clarity, which is a website design which provides website design and management of our website, in the amount of $1.75 million over 5 years.
Chair will entertain a motion to accept both of those proposals for the new members as part of our budget. And as staff goes out on any of these contracts and procurements, soliciting an RFP and going through the process of vetting those projects. So again, I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Any questions on those? Yes, Karen?
Just on, I was surprised that Dun & Bradstreet had all of that kind of data. I didn't think of them as a credit agency, not a, information, but do we vet these contracts every so many years? You know, look at other sources, or are they sort of a unique?
So yes, on the data subscriptions, we actually go through an annual process where we require each of the user, or the departments, I'm sorry, to justify the use, how they're going to use the data, for what purposes, for what projects. And every year, we do try to negotiate down the cost. I believe down in Bradstreet, 2 years ago, we were able to reduce the cost of it, I want to say by $60,000. So we do try to look at them annually. And the departments are required to provide justification as to how they're going to use it. And we do eliminate data subscriptions every year. And we pick up new ones depending on the projects we're engaging in.
Other questions? Yes.
Just really quick, for the Thirst and the Clarity Partners, when are those contracts up?
We actually just went out to bid, so these are new contracts.
They're new? Okay.
They have 2-year, they're 2-year contracts with 3 one-year extension options.
Thank you.
Okay.
Other questions? If not, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, vote of no, and the motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Next item is under the election of officers. Matt Walsh is not here today. I don't know if, Mary, you want to bring the recommendation up?
Yeah, absolutely. The nominating committee met a couple of weeks ago and put this slate together, and you can see it there. I don't think I need to read them off, but would like to recommend that the board approve this slate for our executive committee for the next year.
That's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Questions or comments regarding that? If not, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, a vote of no, the motion carries. Mayor,
I
thank
should
you.
abstain.
One abstention, recognized. Yes. You can say that out loud.
As you
We're
know,
talking- We're talking about gender representation on
I'm-
this
I'm-
board and also on the executive committee.
I'm very, very pleased to see the executive committee. As you know, for a long time, the board has been predominantly male, and not that I don't love you all, but it's nice to see that women are also moving into the leadership positions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, board. Under spring recap, Gordon, you got a lot to recap.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Gordon.
There is going to be basically like a 3-part presentation this morning. I'm going to just kind of hit a recap of what took place during the Capitol bill and just give a reminder or a refresher to our new members about the work that the staff has done and the agency has done leading up to the Capitol bill and laying the groundwork for some of the successes. You know, there are a couple pieces of parts of the Capitol bill that are originally from the tenets or the principles that have been laid out in both Go to 2040 and On to 2050. In both those documents, we talk about increasing the motor fuel tax and indexing that to inflation, and that's something that took place. Nobody else was talking about that except for this agency, and so I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we have been out there talking about this for a long time, and it's finally bearing fruit. I also want to talk about just what the staff has done leading up to that. We regularly talk to the General Assembly and brief them on the different policy initiatives going on. We talk about the capital principles that you all approved, and those again bore fruit as the development of the Capitol bill was going forward. I will say that, you know, we regularly meet with members of the General Assembly. There are 30 new members that are in our region. Right now, to date, we have met with 24 of those individuals this summer. And that's where we do a lot of our, I'm going to say our best work, where we have an opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with them and have a deeper dive into the policy initiatives that are going on. And I say all that just because I think oftentimes we lose sight of what took place over, I'll say, the past 10 years plus. And so I just wanted to share with you what we do and moving forward. I also would like to introduce a couple of our policy staff members. And let me take one step back. nothing that we do here happens without the good policy work that the agency develops. That's the basis of my conversations with the members of the General Assembly. I cannot have a conversation with them without having some solid policy initiatives to advance. And so Lindsay Hollander and Stephanie Levine will provide an overview of the capital bill and the state's operating budget. And then we're going to follow up with some brief discussion led by Aaron about our next steps. You know, some of the priorities that have been addressed as a result of the MFT increase and the indexing are done. And so what do we need to do now? We know that that's not enough to fund transportation moving forward. And so we need to have a discussion about what are the next policy initiatives that the agency wants to advance. And so with that, I will turn it over to Lindsay.
Thanks, Gordon. This board has had many conversations in the past about the fact that we had, for a long time, not had enough revenue to make the sort of investments that, thank you, the sort of investments that we really need in our transportation system and in infrastructure in the region. And while we will get to that later in the presentation, of course, we're going to talk today about Rebuild Illinois and other legislation that had passed during spring session. Rebuild Illinois appropriated funding to a variety of capital infrastructure projects, ranging from transportation to public facilities to schools and to transit. So today we're going to talk about the new sources of revenue that the bills provided for, how those revenues will be used, some of the impacts on transit, some of the impacts on local governments, not only of the capital bill, but also of other legislation that passed during spring session. And then Stephanie is going to talk a bit about the vertical side of the transportation, or the vertical side of the capital bill, if you will, the non-transportation elements of Rebuild Illinois, and also tell you a little bit about a tool that allows you to actually take a closer look at the Rebuild Illinois appropriations. And then, as Gordon said, Aaron will provide some of the on to 2050 implementation impacts and begin a discussion on next steps. So first off, what are the sources of new transportation revenues? Once the transportation revenues in Rebuild Illinois are fully implemented, we'll see $2.8 billion in annual state transportation revenues. This includes, of course, as Gordon said, the long-awaited increase to the state motor fuel tax. The Rebuild Illinois increased the state motor fuel tax by 19 cents, so it is now 38 cents per gallon, and that rate is now going to be indexed, and this is, of course, something that this board has long time advocated for. In addition, the diesel differential, so that's the higher rate that taxpayers pay on diesel fuel, that will increase by, or that has increased by 5 cents as well, so it is now 7.5 cents. I did want to note that that diesel differential was not indexed to inflation. Also, there, through the bills, motor vehicle registration fees for both passenger vehicles and trucks increased, and particularly of note, I think, were the increases for electric vehicles. Previously, electric vehicles paid $35 biannually for their registration fees, significantly lower than other passenger vehicles. Rebuild Illinois brought those registration fees to parity with regular passenger vehicles, plus added an added $100 fee intended to make up for the fact that electric vehicles aren't paying the motor fuel tax because they aren't using actual motor fuel. That said, that $100 fee isn't indexed to inflation, and it's lower than most passenger vehicles will probably be paying in motor fuel tax, which is probably often closer to $200. Bill increased various certificate of title fees, salvage fees, junking fees, and then also over a period of years, starting in a few years and ending in 2026. The state sales tax revenue generated from motor fuel sales will be shifted from the general funds to the road fund. And how much that is really how much that totals to really will depend on the actual price of fuel. So that $2.8 billion we mentioned, there will be a range there. A lot of that is attributable to the fact that it is very hard to predict the price of fuel moving into the future. So, as we've already stated multiple times, these revenues really move forward in implementing on 2050. We have this indexing and increase to the motor fuel tax. Not only that, the MFT is going to be used for ongoing multimodal capital funding with a portion going to transit. And the transportation elements of this capital bill are being funded with transportation user fees, which really does help ensure that those benefiting from those improvements are actually paying the costs of those improvements. So getting into a little bit more detail on where these revenues are going to be going. In blue, you see the state motor fuel tax increase, the amount attributable to that increase. That's going to be going to transit agencies, local governments, and the state for improvements, and that will be available on an ongoing basis. Then up at the top in orange, green, purple, you can see the increases to motor vehicle registration fees and some of those other fees I talked about, the diesel differential increase, and then that sales tax generated from motor fuel sales. That will be going to the road fund, and that'll be used by IDOT for transportation improvements across the state, but then also for debt service. So Rebuild Illinois included $11 billion in bonds that will be issued over the next 6 years, and for roads, for bridges, for transit, for local governments, and those bonds will eventually have to be paid back through these revenues, and we estimate over the next 3 decades that'll be about $17 billion in revenues that will need to be used to pay off those bonds. Here, I wanted to go briefly over what's going to happen to that increase in the state motor fuel tax. Basically, 20% will be used for transit, most of that for transit in northeastern Illinois, and then the remaining 80% for IDOT, and then for local governments to counties, road districts, and municipalities. So let's move into how these capital program funds are actually going to be used over the next 6 years. So Rebuild Illinois was basically conceived of as a 6-year capital program. And real quick about how those funds will support on to 2050 implementation. It does provide some support for the regionally significant projects constrained in onto 2050, and I'll get more into that in a minute. Rebuild Illinois does provide appropriations for CREATE and grade crossing improvements, transit improvements, and also bicycle and pedestrian improvements. Specifically their requirement that IDOT set aside $50 million for bike ped. Also, I wanted to add that while the legislation, Rebuild Illinois, did not require this, there are still opportunities to programs, the unallocated funding based on performance criteria for by IDOT, by the RTA, and by the local governments receiving funding. So this chart gets a bit into the uses of the revenues and then also where they're coming from. And you can see here the rectangles in bold show that about half of the Rebuild Illinois appropriations are coming from bonds and bond proceeds. The remaining come from basically ongoing revenues. And Also, a little more than half, so the areas in blue will be going to IDOT for spending on roads and bridges, and about almost 20% to local governments, counties, townships, and municipalities, and then the remaining to transit, and then also bond proceeds available for rail, freight, airports, ports, grade crossings. And RSPs, regionally significant projects. So in addition to the appropriations to IDOT and other agencies, basically for general project types, so appropriations for things like just general roads and bridges, that then programming decisions will be made on how those are spent. Rebuild Illinois did appropriate about 10% of funds to several specific projects. And if you look at this map in red, you can see several regionally significant projects that were specifically identified for funding either through Rebuild Illinois appropriations or through some of the initial programming information that we have. However, the vast majority of RSPs constrained in on to 2050, and you can see those in yellow on the map, were not named, and at this point it's unclear to what extent those projects will receive funding. Also on this map, in purple, you can see several projects identified in not only just the capital package, but then also in the operating budget that we see as technically qualifying as RSPs, but they are not currently constrained in the plan. And if those were to proceed past preliminary engineering, they would either have to be included in the next plan cycle or amended onto 2050. So what are the impacts to transit in northeastern Illinois? Well, now we have some new dedicated ongoing revenues to transit, which is a very exciting development. However, this funding really does remain insufficient to meet some of the investment needs that we see over the next 30 years. I told you I'd get to the part where we don't have enough money still. So I want to spend a minute on this chart because I think that this is pretty key to how the next 30 years could look for the region's transit system. So on the left, the bar shows that we need an additional 43 billion, or we had needed an additional 43 billion over current resources just to keep the region's transit system in its current condition, the assets in their current condition over the next 30 years. And then on top of that, we had needed an additional 5 billion if we had wanted to meet onto 2050's condition targets for improving the state of repair of the transit system. And so that's about $48 billion that we had looked at needing over about 30 years. Then on the right, you can see in green how far Rebuild Illinois goes toward fulfilling those needs. We've got about $2.7 billion in bond proceeds over the next 6 years for the transit system, and then we estimate that ongoing motor fuel tax revenue that will be going to the RTA will be about $10.8 billion over the next 30 years. So to actually meet the condition targets that we set in onto 2050, which would not even bring the system to a full state of good repair, we would still need about $34 billion more than what Rebuild Illinois provided for the region's transit system. Now we'll move on to local impacts, and so in this part we won't focus completely on transportation actually. So as you all know, many of the provisions in Rebuild Illinois, and then also some of the other legislation that passed in the spring, had an impact on local governments. Gaming, which is something Stephanie will get into in a minute, that certainly has impacts to the region's local governments. The expansion of gaming will allow for 3 additional casinos in the region, and some municipalities would experience increased revenues from those casinos. Also, motor fuel taxes, local motor fuel taxes. Rebuild Illinois provided additional authorization for counties. For one, previously, just DuPage, Kane, and McHenry counties had the ability to impose local motor fuel taxes, and they were allowed to impose 4 cents a gallon, and they all have 4 cents per gallon motor fuel taxes. Also, Cook is home rule, so they're allowed to impose motor fuel taxes as they choose, and they happen to have a 6-cent one. Under Rebuild Illinois, Lake and Will also be able to impose local motor fuel taxes, and also the color counties will be able to impose up to 8 cents per gallon. Also, I wanted to add that municipalities will also have increased ability to impose motor fuel taxes under Rebuild Illinois. So, previously, just home rule municipalities could impose motor fuel taxes. And last time we looked at this, there were about 60 municipalities in the region that imposed motor fuel taxes. Now, municipalities within Cook County will be allowed to impose a rate of up to 3 cents per gallon. So remote sales, and this was actually enacted as part of Rebuild Illinois, and it's called the Leveling the Playing Field for Illinois Retail Act. Basically, it makes some major changes to how remote sales are taxed. So basically, if you buy something from an out-of-state company, under current law, you pay the state use tax. So the company would impose a 6.25% use tax. And that money, some of it would stay with the state, and then some of it would go to a few entities such as the RTA, and then the rest would be sent to counties and municipalities based on population. And it was just the state use tax and no local other taxes applied. Starting next summer, things will be a bit different. These out-of-state companies selling goods to Illinois consumers will actually have to impose both state and local taxes. Also, those taxes will be imposed based on that location of delivery. So the person who's doing the ordering, where they're sitting and where that item is being delivered to, that's how the tax rate will be determined, and that's where the money will go. So the money, if I'm ordering something from out of state to this building, the tax rates will be going to the state, to the RTA, to Cook County, and to the city of Chicago. And all those local taxes will apply, and the state portion will go to Chicago based on that delivery location. And then lastly, this was a separate piece of legislation, the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, but it does have some major local implications, so we did want to mention it here today. This act legalized recreational cannabis. So first of all, the state will be implementing a state cannabis tax, and the revenues, after they're actually used by the state to administer the act, they will go toward the items in this chart. And I did want to draw your attention to the yellow bar, which shows the 8% going to the local government distributive fund, which will be revenues going to counties and municipalities based on population. Also, local governments, specifically counties and municipalities, through their business licensing and zoning authorities, can restrict these cannabis businesses. And then also, if a local government zoning does allow for a dispensary, they are allowed to impose local taxes, and counties can also impose local taxes. So I'm going to be passing the presentation over to Stephanie, who's going to be going over elements of the vertical capital side of the bill.
Is it possible to get the slides from this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, that
It'd be
would
great
be
to
really
have those even
helpful.
doing a presentation.
Yeah, it was very, very well done.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm going to move on to some non-transportation revenues now. There are a number of new and expanded revenue sources for non-transportation projects, about half of which will come from the gaming expansion. the governor's office is estimating that at full implementation, $350 million will be generated annually from these measures. This will come from taxes and admission fees collected at the new casinos. There will be an expansion of video gaming terminals, as well as an increase to the tax rate on those terminals, as well as an expansion of some of the racinos, as well as the legalization of sports betting. I think it's important to note that many of these new revenues from gaming are new and unproven, so it's sort of unclear when or if full implementation will actually take place for these revenues. Rebuild, Rebuild Illinois also increases the cigarette tax, as well as starting January 1st, 2020, will impose a new state parking tax. For changes to the sourcing of sales tax from remote sellers, which was that flow chart Lindsay showed earlier, we're expecting this to result in an increase in overall state sales tax revenue that's collected, a portion of which will go to the Build Illinois Bond Fund. These new revenues will support everything from economic development to broadband infrastructure, investment in public buildings and facilities, educational institutions, among many other topic areas. Rebuild Illinois also addresses a number of natural resource and housing priorities that are identified in On to 2050. There's new funding for open space acquisition and preservation, which restores funding to many state programs that have been dormant over the last 5 to 10 years. There's significant funding that will be provided for drinking water infrastructure, although given the need across the state and within the region, particularly when it comes to replacement of lead service lines, we don't expect this to be sufficient. There are numerous funds that will be made available as grants to local governments for water quality and sewage treatment, as well as flood mitigation. These will be provided as grants, and we'll look at some of those line items in a bit when I do a demonstration of our tool. $200 million has been appropriated to the Illinois Housing Development Authority, which will be used for affordable housing. However, Rebuild doesn't stipulate how those funds will be programmed across the state, so that's something else we're looking forward to learning more about. I think also, with regards to these types of programs, it's important to note that the shift in sales tax from general funds into the road fund that Lindsay mentioned earlier, although that will make more funding available for transportation projects, over time will diminish funds available on an ongoing basis for these types of programs, which do come generally from the general funds. Now that we've looked at some of the transportation and non-transportation projects at a pretty high level, I want to demonstrate a tool that we developed here at CMAP that will allow both that we've been using on staff, and we hope that our partners will use to dive a little bit deeper into the details of the program. So earlier in the presentation, Lindsay showed this capital appropriations graph, and although it does appear on the surface level to be a pretty simple pie chart, it was actually, unfortunately, quite difficult to make. As enacted, the piece of legislation, this Public Act here, has all of the appropriations, about 1,400 of them, in paragraph form. So if you want to answer some of the important policy questions that we're interested in here at CMAP, like, for example, how much funding will go to transit in the region? It's pretty difficult without doing a Control F on that PDF, searching for keywords, pulling everything out, maybe making your own Excel document, and hoping for the best. So On to 2050 calls for the improved access of public information through transparency and the use of technology. So in the spirit of this recommendation, we took this PDF and wrote a script that pulls out all of those appropriations and project types in a way that can be sorted and filtered in an Excel document. So I am going to take some time now to exit this presentation and just do a really brief demo of that tool, because it's been helpful for us here at CMAP, but we really hope that it's also helpful for all of you guys at your agencies and organizations. So right now, if you go onto our homepage, this is downloadable on our homepage, but it's also available as a policy update with some additional context. Before I jump in, I do want to just mention a few caveats about using this tool. It is not CMAP's analysis of Rebuild Illinois, it's simply a transcription of the legislation itself. And the reason we did it this way was we want to be able to enable whatever kind of analysis you want to conduct. As such, it's really just the appropriations, which means that not all of the projects and programs in this tool and in the legislation are guaranteed to move forward. Additionally, many of these projects and programs are backed by new and unproven revenue sources and are contingent on the state issuing the bonds that are required to move these projects forward. So right now there's a lot of uncertainty around the timeline for that. And then the last thing I want to mention is, as we'll see in a minute, There are many very specific projects that are itemized in this legislation, but there are also lots of broad buckets of funding that will be programmed. So side-by-side comparisons of certain geographies may not be really the best way to use this, because you have to keep in mind there's a lot of those broad categories of funding. So in the spreadsheet, we really have just the exact components of each of those paragraphs for the appropriations. So you have this article and section number if for some reason like us you've printed out the entire bill and you have it next to your computer while you're looking at this and you want to double check that you're in the right article. We have the fund that will provide the revenues for these projects, the managing departments, the appropriation amount, the grantee, so this will be the entity that is most downstream that's identified within the appropriation, and then we have the purpose of the actual projects. So one way you might want to use this is look at certain topic areas. So if you are interested perhaps in what kind of funding projects and programs will go to flood mitigation, you could do a simple text search in the purpose column. So I'm just going to do flood because I want to capture anything that's flood or flooding. And we can see that now I'm going to order it by appropriation amount. So the largest source of funding for flood hazard mitigation plans and cost sharing will go to the Department of Natural Resources. We have some other funds that will go to the Office of Water Resources in smaller amounts, but you can see also that although those are going to the state, they're for specific projects, whereas this is just a larger bucket of funds. Additionally, in smaller amounts, you can see some of those specific line items that I mentioned for Libertyville, Arlington Heights, for the purposes of primarily flood mitigation, flood damage reduction, although that one we can see is going to, again, to the Office of Water Resources. So this is just one way. We hope that sort of by providing the bare bones of the legislation, you could take this and run with it. Something we've done internally is, we're interested in how much is coming to the region, so that's something we took the time to do, but want to provide this in its sort of essential form to our partners. I'm going to transition back to the presentation now. And so it's where Rebuild Illinois yourself, and hand it over to Erin, who's going to talk a bit about the big picture of how Rebuild Illinois will help us implement onto 2050.
Great, well, thank you both. Before I dive into where I think that we want to engage the board in a conversation about what we should be doing next, I will just pause and see if there are questions about anything that Lindsay or Stephanie presented on.
I just want to make a comment. I kind of asked in July that something like this be done by staff to analyze a huge multi-paged legislation regarding so-called capital plan. And in fact, for us in local government, we also know that there's been other promises made or appropriations made by some of the members that have not specifically come out yet. So there's a lot in the big buckets that will eventually, we think, then be drilled down so you can then enter it into all those various categories. But in the terms of the old, they're legislative initiatives for most of us who've been around long enough to understand it. But I want to say to staff, thank you. How quickly you moved to identify a very complicated capital bill as spelled out. I also want to mention that the Illinois Municipal League and Metro Mayor's Caucus were significant partners in that sole sourcing on sales tax, out-of-state sales tax. In fact, it was through the IML that legislation passed. So local government has been hand in hand in trying to get and work with the General Assembly on this capital bill. And again, I congratulate CMAP in our efforts about indexing motor fuel tax and the use of motor fuel, or the need for a motor fuel tax increase going forward from day one. As we said when we formed this organization and sat in our first vision session, we can lay out all the great plans in the world, but where's the money? Show me the money, because nothing can get done without it. So finally, this year, a major significance, and certainly the last 20 plus years of the General Assembly finally coming together and putting out a capital bill that will go a long, long way in supporting our needs. And as indicated, $38 billion still needed. And I guess my only question would be, is that that's certainly without any federal assistance, I gather, in those estimates of what we would need for the region, and whether or not any federal infusion could significantly, reduce that amount or add to our local benefit by working with them.
that is assuming that federal resources continue as they had been, and is not assuming any additional infusion. So yes, and I'm sure Pena can speak, but an additional federal infusion would be very beneficial to reducing that gap.
John?
I just want to also say that it's a great tool you made with the spreadsheet, with the analysis of the bill, especially on the projects. But again, I think the comments that you said need to be reiterated, because often there's a rush to take this data and then do an analysis without remembering the important aspects of what was said, which is that there are these larger pots that are unassigned, and even the projects that are assigned does not guarantee that they will happen. It does not guarantee they will be funded. There are no funding agreements, as I know of yet, on many of these projects. They're probably not even close to getting those ready to go, or know when they're going to fund these projects. And just because something says flooding, it may be flooding, but another project may actually address flooding without saying flooding. Oftentimes, these descriptions, as being someone who's written them both at the federal and state level in the past, oftentimes incorporate a lot of different aspects of the project. So saying this much is going to flooding is not necessarily guaranteed. There could be a lot of projects that address flooding. While I know many of the people in this room understand that, the folks at home may not understand that, and certainly oftentimes the press do not understand that. The complexity that goes into each and every one of these things. And oftentimes there's a lot more to the story on each and every project than is simply encapsulated within a bill like this. So don't rush to take it and pull it apart without delving much deeper into what it all says.
And I think part two of my comment to staff back in July was, if possible, to monitor what's been up here, if that's possible for us to follow up with these projects, and to certainly encapsulate or certainly increase the numbers if in fact some of the bigger pots do in fact go out to specific projects. I know it's asking a lot of staff to attempt to try to do that, but now that they have the matrix up here, I'm wondering if that's for a follow-up on our part to see how those projects did in fact pan out, when received, when implemented, et cetera. But you're right, John, there's a lot of detail. I mean, there's much detail in the ask that took place by local governments for some of these funds, and for the most part, a lot of them are portions of possibly a larger project that local governments had submitted. But again, just from a monitoring standpoint, I'd be interested to see how this all pans out. 2 years, certainly within a year.
Actually, you make an excellent point as well. I mean, it would be interesting to see how much those investments then capitalized on further investments,
Partly, right.
whether that they be from local sources or even private sources, oftentimes. And what that also meant, looking back at the last legislation, as long ago as that was, and a lot of us were around, some of us weren't, there were a lot of projects that never were funded on the last capital bill, and many that were promised but simply were brushed away. So I also, again, caution, just because it's in there today doesn't mean that somebody 2 or 3 years down the line won't decide to brush it away.
Rick?
Would it be possible to get a link to that spreadsheet, being technologically challenged, if I had to explain to someone how to get there? That would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, we can make that available to the board.
Thank you.
You go with instructions, right, Rick?
Pardon me?
With instructions, right?
Yeah.
So
And graphics.
that was one thing I wanted to mention. Thank you for underscoring those points about how to use the spreadsheet. When you open it, you'll see there's a few tabs at the bottom. The first tab is sort of a read me how to use this, and it reiterates some of these points that we've been making, but also describes all of the different columns, some of them which have, if they have been amended, how they have been amended, and it's pretty comprehensive. So again, if you are going to be using these as talking points, keeping all those considerations in mind when you use data from the tool.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments. I think both of the documents in the spreadsheet are a really good addition and good pieces of work. A couple of comments specifically related to the transit piece. Thank you for belaboring the point or highlighting the point of these. While this is the largest capital program in the state of Illinois' history, this is to some extent potentially just a blip on the radar in terms of chipping away at our state of good repair. It's a point we're making loudly and will continue to make for the next many years. but it's good to have other people echoing that point as well, because we've actually shown, you've got the bar chart kind of boxy thing, we've done it in a more of a line chart diagram to show that if you just get this capital bill and nothing else happens, basically, especially focus on the transit space, we just drop right off back to where we are in advance of this capital bill. So it literally is great money, well needed, but it doesn't really have a significant long-term impact, to the point that while we're looking to track projects in terms of spend and delivery, if nothing else for accountability to the legislators, the taxpayers, and the riding public. But I think more importantly, the 4 EDs of the transit agencies are talking about sort of playing the long game here, that we want to show, even by sort of year 3, that we have chipped away at, show meaningful impact on our chipping away at the state of good repair backlog, developing and delivering real projects, but then making the case for the next capital. While we've got some of this pay-as-you-go money that's a much smaller pot of money that happens in perpetuity, the bond package is just a 5-year package, and we need to sort of year 3 be all as a region lining up for, and really across the state lining up for the one that hopefully slots in right behind that, so we don't go back into this pattern of 10-year droughts between capital programs. Because, as I like to say, it's not the right way to run a railroad. One point that I will just raise, and I think there's a lot more conversation happening around this, the comments in the performance-based program planning and programming process. We are all very, in the transit space, I'll just speak to transit, very early in doing all that work, continuing to evolve and develop, I think, a more robust and even more transparent way of doing that. I will say, though, we have a very robust capital planning process each year that creates a 5-year rolling capital program that we work with the service boards between allocating the monies and identifying what projects those projects fund. I think people in the past have sort of said, well, we don't really know what you do, kind of how that sausage gets made. I think the very practical reality is we've had so little money to spend that it's all just going to basically sort of belts and suspenders kind of work. Nothing super exciting, and it's going to be a long time before we actually start talking about big expansions and big enhancement projects. So it's going to be, signal system upgrades, rail tracks, ties, kind of unexciting stuff. But it's all now well documented in the asset condition assessment studies that we have, and that's the basis by which, at least for the first few years, we're going to be programming any dollar. There's not going to be much in the world of sort of shiny, bright, and new. It will be from a inside baseball perspective, but maybe not so much from a riding public perspective. But I will say they are looking to program significant monies on rolling stock in terms of both locomotives and rail cars and buses as well. So that's it, but we'll continue. So I appreciate the work that's being done. It is helpful in sort of our ongoing cause too.
All right, so the question really is, where do we go from here as an agency? Rebuild Illinois enacted a number of key implementation activities that we recommended in 2050 and in 2040. And so as we think about the legacy of those plans, right, we've been out in the region, you have been out in this region talking about the importance of raising the motor fuel tax, indexing to inflation, really funding bike and transit infrastructure, using user fees to make sure that, who benefits also is paying for the system enhancements. And some of the other things too, like Lindsay mentioned, funding for CREATE, funding for water infrastructure as well. But, there are some other key 2050 recommendations that we still believe continue to need to be addressed if we're going to fully achieve the goals of having a prosperous region for everyone here. So, next slide. This slide, just as a reminder here, and shows the revenue forecasts, motor fuel tax and road. You can see here the lower purplish bar is where we were projecting before, and sort of the higher dashed purple bar is where we are after the MFT increase. But you can see that, it still isn't going to continue to address our overall capital system needs. And sort of like Leanne was saying, right, how do we get ahead of, we're making some progress now, but prices are going to continue to increase here. So, Rebuild Illinois didn't address potential replacements for the motor fuel tax. And as Trustee Williams noted earlier today, the coordinating committee heard about road usage charges and, the future of how we fund infrastructure and what the implications of a road usage charge pilot in the region might be. So ON2 2050 recommends that the state replace motor fuel tax with a road usage charge after piloting some implementation and studying the impacts and the questions that I think that are still out there. Some of the other things that we see as missed opportunities here are really preparing for those emerging mobility trends. It wasn't a focus of Rebuild Illinois, but we are seeing the benefits of other states who are investing in transportation technology like connected and adaptive signals. So as these unallocated buckets of funds continue to be programmed, we're sort of keeping an eye towards, well, where are the opportunities to find these places to build in things like emerging mobility trends? Also, there's an opportunity in the transportation network companies, those TNCs or rideshare companies of Uber and Lyft. The current legislation governing them will expire in June of 2020, which will provide an opportunity to figure out, what else we want to do here related to the TNCs and raise the bar for regulation, data sharing, and also for fees. So just to put those forth, those are just a couple areas where we see that there's still continued opportunity for us as a region to start an enhanced conversation around transportation funding and priorities here. So my question to the board really is what should CMAP's role be moving forward on implementing the capital plan? I'll sort of take these just one at a time.
You're looking for comments.
I am looking for
Yes.
comments.
We're just so in awe of the money we have now.
Yeah.
Our heads are filled with what we're gonna do tomorrow versus next year or the year after.
Right. One thought, because it's come up in some of the transportation discussions, but the efficiency of moving projects and not having them held up at certain decision points or approval points for project agreements and that sort of thing. So I don't know if CMAP is in a position to collaborate with some of the state agencies that are charged with that to kind of monitor, is it a technology thing, is it a staffing thing, but how we can really, I think, help in that regard.
Mayor's a good point. In fact, I was gonna bring it up a little bit later. Next month, we're meeting the joint MPO Policy Committee and the board. We'll double the board members here. And the Secretary of Transportation will be there. And I don't just like to put anybody on the spot, but that is a continuing and probably even more growing concern today about, on one hand, the Fed is requiring us to spend our money, and rightly so, to be properly matched. But the other problem we have is because of the delay of projects, this carryover from year to year to year, not necessarily because the match wasn't there, but because of the process. And that is both probably obviously a federal and state problem. And how do we reduce it? How do we get these time periods down from sometimes, a year and a half to reasonable, within 9 months, if that's possible? I think it's the kind of question we need to even ask our Secretary of Transportation when he comes here next month, because that would have been one of my questions. And there was a concern with the changeover in administration and the loss of, from what I'm hearing, there's been quite a loss of staff or people leaving IDOT. And how are those vacancies being filled? The question at one time was going to be they're going to contract that stuff out, which is fine as long as it gets done. So again, it goes back to the questions of IDOT of how they're going to now handle this huge transportation bill and process local government and or county projects in a more efficient way, that we're not dragging this capital plan out for the next 5 years just to get things implemented when they could be done within a reasonable time, a year and a half. So it's a good point.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it is, and it is also on the federal level as well. I can think of a project in my mind, and I'll leave nameless right now, that's in its 19th year of phase 1. So I don't think we've quite achieved the record yet, but we're working on it. Some of this is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, the cost, the factors of increasing costs in these projects because of these delays needs to be looked at as well. It would be a fascinating study to look at what delays have cost in this region, just simply review delays that have just gone on far longer than they should have. And what is that as cost in terms of construction cost increase in multipliers over that time frame? It would be staggering. I'm sure it is in the billions. And so it is an excellent point. The review process, it almost seems like something we constantly say, but nothing is ever really truly done. So, but I think also going forward is we brought up already today, and we're already seeing the signs on, and one thing that CMAP can do and keep an eye on as kind of an independent watcher of this is the revenue projections. we're already seeing early signs that revenue is not going to be where they had expected or hoped it to be from many of these revenue sources. When you have communities bailing out of potential funding sources, we have projects that were counted on, major projects that were counted as funding sources that in all likelihood will not be happening anytime soon. These are things, and that's just the scratch the surface. Plus the things that staff already indicated, which is, you know, the volatility of the cost of, you know, crude itself. So these are things I think we need to kind of keep an eye on and see where we really are on the projections, how far we're already off, just going out the gate. I think the gap may end up being bigger than is already projected.
I agree, and not being a board filled with economists, you know, to project, but I think the point is correct. If we do hit a recession, does that impact the opportunity to match funds? Because you don't have it locally anymore because the revenues aren't being generated. So it's a big picture question, I think, of any type of economic downfall impacting projects forward. Other comments, questions?
Yeah, I got one real quick. So I know that there's a decent amount of quote-unquote earmarks that were included with this. I know that all municipalities will see an increase in their MFT funding, but many of those municipalities don't have a comprehensive road program, and so they fund, you know, the worst road first. I mean, maybe there's some benefit to reaching out to those municipalities that were earmarked some projects and see how maybe we could help with our call for projects, that kind of thing. But yeah, I guess the more significant one is municipalities that have funding for MFT that just fund roads every year when there's no local performance-based. And I know we did a call for those last year, and I think we had 50 communities submit that currently don't have a program, which is very substantial, I think. So.
Well, and right, it was a matter of just keeping up with maintenance, which you would consider patching and or seal coating roads to to reconstruction. But you're right. I mean, a lot of local towns, if they had their way, they'd probably reconstruct half their roads. But you're right, they don't have a plan.
And Mayor, following up on Matt's comments, I know we're going to get into embedded staff and where that's at, but I think this is a place with the local communities where CMAP could really help if certain projects have been allocated to communities that might not have the resources and staff. You know, we're telling the federal government to move quickly. We need the communities to at times too. So both through the embedded staff and then just through some of these programs, you all could be a really big help in having local communities know what's out there and how they should approach it.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's a general pull it off the shelf plan for local governments to, for us to come up with there's a guideline possibly for you to follow and an analysis of your local roads. I mean, that could be done without necessarily even embedding. If we have a best practice out there as to some community who's going about doing exactly what you're talking about, that's something that thing we could possibly generate and give to local governments.
So the next two questions, I'm
No,
sorry.
please.
Go ahead.
I wanted to see where we were in the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was sort of going to combine the next two questions, which are really like what transportation priorities should the region advocate in the near term? But then thinking about it in the construct of we need to develop a legislative agenda, a state legislative agenda as well too. So what should we be thinking about moving forward here? You know, many of the things that we had been advocating for that Gordon and his team had been down in Springfield talking about, right? We've got this. We want to thank you for, taking the hard vote and increasing MFT, but, what's next? What do you see?
I'll be selfish in point number 3 that I made in July, and that's to get funding for this agency from Springfield other than IDOT money. How's that?
Well, now I'm officially on board,
There
so
you
I
go.
officially heard that.
That was your
twice.
challenge, I think I asked, right?
Twice, yes.
Mayor, good.
Well, and just to follow up, Mr. Chairman, on your comment, for me, low-hanging fruit would be advocating for legislation that gives this organization a dedicated funding stream. It depended on the administration and the state of the state at the time. Every year, we've had to go to the state kind of hat in hat and advocate for what we should be getting automatically. And if we can secure a dedicated funding stream, it's a lot easier for us to plan and budget and all those other things.
Yeah, Mayor, and I think now's the time. I mean, it was a huge capital, billions of dollars, and we felt, maybe $3 million for this agency would help support the planning side of it. And maybe statewide 5 million or 6 million now to the other MPOs that are out there is being not all just for us. I don't think it's a whole big ask, but you're right. In the old days, they wouldn't give you 2 cents, but hopefully now we've got a progressive General Assembly and a governor who sees what this agency and other agencies throughout the state are doing to support proper planning going forward, and we could approach them again. Gordon, I know I'm looking at you, but
I don't know why you're looking at me.
but yes.
Well, great.
Other comments about? Well, think about it anyway. If decision isn't going to be made today, but you want to throw those questions back out to the board members in a memo, just they can consider it, and when you get it, think about some other things we didn't talk about today that you may see a need for us going forward with. So, good point.
Great.
That's it?
We have.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice presentation. By the way, a lot of this legislation really what we've asked for is local government's decision-making, and it's now back in our court on some of the other opportunities, both counties and local governments, in making decisions about actually raising taxes locally. So for as much as we've cried for years about give us the power, a lot of this legislation gives local government a few bucks, or the power to raise a few bucks. So whether it's through cannabis, whether it's through motor fuel tax, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm glad to see that anyway. Moving on to the last item, and that's the embedded staff planner. Maggie?
I am not Maggie. Good morning, I'm Stephanie Seibert, I'm the Deputy of Planning. I'm just gonna do a couple of just broad overview updates, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Maggie Clark, who is one of our on-the-ground community planners.
There we go.
Your mic on?
It's on now.
There you go.
Thank you. So our pilot began in earnest in March, and really we're providing on-the-ground support to communities that have never had a planner before in their communities, and so really trying to build their capacity. And through this pilot program, we're really striving to not only help that partner community, but also help inform all of our work here at CMAP. So how can we take that information back and look at our existing programs like the LTA program and try to make those more relevant, and then apply those lessons learned to the entire region so we can build the capacity of the entire region. So those are sort of the goals of this project, but as I said at the beginning, to give you this update and to give you a real glimpse into what she has learned so far since March at being at Sauk Village, I wanted to turn it over to Maggie Jar to give you a more detailed update.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As Stephanie mentioned, we launched the Embedded Staff Planner program in March of this year in partnership with the villages of Calumet Park and Sauk Village. Over the course of the entire 4-year demonstration project, CMAP staff will be placed in a total of 6 communities as embedded staff planners to serve as temporary part-time staff, offering flexible support for each municipality for up to a 2-year period. Our planners will be devoting 3 days per week to their community, spending 2 days on site and the equivalent of 1 additional day devoted to the municipality from CMAP's office. So this morning I wanted to provide you with an overview of what our program approach has been, and also talk a little bit about our work in Sauk Village, where, as Stephanie mentioned, I am serving as the village planner through this program. And first, to reiterate a little bit about why it is that we're undertaking this work, the goal of the demonstration project is to strengthen the ability of the participating municipalities to set and achieve their community's goals. And through that work, to increase CMAP's understanding of how we can best be assessing and building local capacity. And so ultimately, we'd like the agency to be identifying ways that we can best direct our staff and other resources to improve capacity at a local level, and then figuring out what is the best way to scale that technical assistance to serve capacity-constrained communities throughout our entire region. And so to achieve this goal, we developed an approach that can be applied to all 6 of the pilot communities through this program to assess their current capacity and existing needs. The first 3 months on site, our planners are spending time getting to know officials, staff, and the communities, so that in the following 3 months, we can create customized action plans that will clearly define the work that we'll be undertaking on behalf of that municipality. The action plan defines a variety of activities that the planner will be responsible for undertaking, and will seek to build on the community's successes, promote long-range strategic planning, and achieve local and regional objectives. And that really brings us up to date with the first two communities. We now have defined action plans for the villages of Calumet Park and Sauk Village. The action plans will be updated every 6 months to reflect on our progress and also to account for new opportunities as they arise. And in the final months of our engagement, we'll also be building in some time to assess the municipality's need for continuing planning assistance and recommend feasible options that would best serve that municipality. We'll also be assisting with transitioning our key responsibilities to other municipal staff or new staff. We do want to ensure that we take the necessary steps to make sure the municipality can sustain long-lasting capacity. And with that, I thought I'd share with you a few of the activities that are included in Sauk Village's action plan. These are examples that will focus on funding transportation projects, facilitating professional development, and advancing local plans. So the first activity is to work with village staff to create an implementation and finance plan for a multi-use path along Sauk Trail and 223rd Street. You know, earlier this year, the village was awarded funds through the county's Invest in Cook program to take on a phase 1 engineering study, which was incredibly exciting. This was a priority project identified in their recent comprehensive plan. But even so, the village staff and officials are already starting to ask, so what about the next phase? What is the best way that we can position ourselves to be able to access and navigate the many transportation investment programs that exist to support this kind of work? And so through this planning activity, we'll be painting a more comprehensive picture of how this project can be taken all the way through to completion. Through a memo, we'll be defining the remaining phases of work, identifying the potential fund sources and associated application timeframes, and also outlining anticipated roles and responsibilities of village staff, officials, and other stakeholders in taking those next steps. The memo can then be used to advance implementation efforts, apply for that funding, for example, monitor and assess ongoing activities, and incorporate estimated project costs into future budgets and capital improvement planning. The next activity is to provide the village board with a custom training. The intent of this training will be to provide education on water planning and management practices and encouraging some productive discussion amongst board members around this very important local issue. So my role will be to help coordinate and facilitate the training to benefit the board in understanding some key aspects of water management, bringing in also other CMAP and partners who have expertise in water resources. And I should note that there are many topics of interest, and so if this first training is successful, we'll be looking to bring additional trainings to the board, tackling topics such as housing issues, the regional economy, and to connect to the earlier presentation, there's a lot of questions about what does this capital bill mean? We saw Sauk Village named in a couple places, and we'd love to learn more about how this exactly is going to play out and connect to our priorities. Importantly, and on the subject of water resources, we'll also be undertaking some data collection activities to set the village up to create a capital improvement program for which they do not have a CIP currently. There are also a number of activities described in our action plan to address vacant property challenges, and they include operationalizing local survey data on vacant and abandoned homes, engaging with the South Suburban Land Bank to better understand their programs and processes and discuss some opportunities for collaboration, and also working with our partners at the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus and the Metropolitan Planning Council to coordinate some targeted technical assistance through the Homes for a Changing Region program. And so together, these activities will help officials and staff strategize the best approach for targeting housing stabilization efforts within the village. I'm really looking forward to getting underway with these activities, among others. It's already been a great learning experience, particularly getting a front row seat to how officials and staff can really incorporate their local plans into everyday decision making and how they advance plan priorities through their work. And with that, I'll pause and be happy to answer, Stephanie and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have about the work in Sauk Village or the demonstration project overall.
Rita?
So, Maggie, how did you find the staff as far as how open they were or how receptive they were to you coming and working with them?
Yeah, very open. And I would say, I came in March just on the heels of the adoption of their new comprehensive plan. So there was a lot of great energy already around the ideas in that plan, and having an additional staff person specifically dedicated to looking at how they can advance those priorities. There was a lot of excitement, and we've, myself and Patrick Day, who's in Calumet Park, we've been given great access to attending department head meetings, calling our own meetings of staff to get to know them, their priorities, and see how we might be most impactful in our time there.
I've been a big advocate of this from the beginning. I think it's just a great idea. And you touched on what we had just talked about when we went through the new types of things that are being funded through the state, having somebody there that can help with that. So I think that's just great.
Yeah, or Diane?
So, like Rita, I've been an advocate for this from the beginning as well. I think it just makes all the sense in the world, and there's a real need for it. I'm curious as to whether you're getting any sense of how you will think about transitioning these sort of responsibilities. So as our intent is to build capacity so that people can do these, or communities can do these things for themselves. So I'm wondering if you're getting any ideas about how you might make that happen.
Yeah, well, one step that we're taking is in the development of the action plans where we have specific activities outlined that we'll be undertaking. We're identifying a key department or staff person or committee or commission locally that we can be thinking of as sort of the lead partner with us on that. So that's one way that we'll be looking to do that, and at least in the first months of executing the action plans that we might have a clear idea of, when that transition time comes, who is the appropriate staff person to maybe take on some of these newer responsibilities, or once the two-year engagement is coming to a close, when we sit down to talk about what really are the key functions that the planner, embedded staff planner, has been executing, what might you want to consider in maybe looking for a part-time planner or a shared staff person. We'll be talking about what sort of options exist moving forward.
Because I guess my concern, of course, is that those communities that you're helping are not likely to have the resources to hire staff to replace you. So it won't be a trade-off of one for one sort of thing. So that we are going to have to be pretty deliberate, I think, in how we transition those responsibilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe they'll be at a point where they won't take as much time as you're having to take up front to do that.
Yeah, well, we don't want to be the capacity, we want to leave the capacity. So we'll be thinking through some strategies to identify ways to do that.
And I think I would just suggest we keep in mind too the idea of shared resources. So that maybe there's 2 or 3 communities, quite frankly, that they're in close proximity or whatever, that could benefit from jointly hiring somebody to do that sort of thing.
That's exactly where we should be going. You're right. Any other questions? Good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I always love when people are embedded in local government. We just had a story at the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus where we had an intern work in Lake Forest or one of the towns up North Shore, working on an ordinance, and she came back and said, I just can't believe how wonderful local government is and what it takes to get things done. It was, I wish it was a college requirement of every person to spend 6 months in local government to find out what it's all about. It's a core of government. It's where everything takes place. Besides what the hell's taking place nationally or statewide, local government works, and that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Is that enough? Again, our next meeting, we have now moved that to Thursday, October 10th, not Wednesday, but Thursday for our joint policy, our next board meeting with the policy MPO group. So please mark your calendars. We'll try to send out a couple more reminders. We have never done that before. So Thursday, October 10th of next month. Our executive committee will meet quickly in the back room there after this meeting. You'll
In
see
the
how
back
quick,
room.
you'll see how quick that moved. But that might only,
In the
any
transparent
comments, I'm sorry, from the public, yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm like interested about like the gaming bill that got passed. So that means like the money that goes towards the gambling is gonna go towards like capital projects.
Yeah, some of the vertical capital projects.
That's good, cause we need new paratransit vehicles for the city of Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No other comments or oh,
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just want y'all to make sure, once we get it, make sure to process it very carefully, and especially we got to educate from all walks of life, especially especially in the disability community. Some of them don't understand about safety issues, and then because it's like telling them, like talking through a brick wall. So we got to tell them to make sure safety is more important because their lives is on the line like a ticking time bomb waiting to happen. So we got to make sure to educate them in all walks of life, even if in different languages. So we need to learn how to do that, to get that ready once we get this bill thing. But we got to make sure to get different organizations to make sure to translate in other languages, including for those who are hard of hearing and also for the sign language people. So we need that to get it well prepared and make sure that they're going in the right direction so we won't go back like a flashback again in the past.
so noted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded. Any questions? All in favor, signify by the usual manner. Motion carried, meeting adjourned.
Yeah, good to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you.
Aaron, that was a good.
Okay, so you were never a step.
Really?
No.